There we go. And once again, I would love to welcome everyone to the Los Angeles Birders webinar for September 13th. Yeah, 13th. Please, if you're not a member yet of Los Angeles Birders, please join. You can go to our website at www.labirders.org and simply click join. And your $20 per year or life membership, if you wish, helps support these webinars, our science projects, and scholarships, things like that. So it's well used. We're all volunteer. 100% of all donations and all memberships go into support lab in one way or the other. And I think that's it. Oh, and at this point, I think I would like to introduce David Bell, who will introduce our speaker for tonight. David?
All right, well, welcome everybody, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Cooper. I've known Dan for a long time. We both grew up in the Pasadena area, and Dan is a great birder. He, I think, describes himself as more of an impression birder rather than a field mark birder, but he is one of the very best. Dan is a lifelong resident of Southern California. He is regarded as an expert of the birds of the region. He has degrees from Harvard, UC Riverside, and UCLA, and currently works as a senior conservation biologist for the Resource Conservation District in the Santa Monica Mountains. Through research and independent consulting, he has spent more than 20 years conducting surveys and analyzing bird populations from the deserts to the coast, including rare and protected species such as the California gnatcatcher and the cactus wren. Dan has served on many environmental advisory boards and committees, including most recently on the Oak Park Park and Recreation's Planning Committee. Since 2012, he and his family have made their home in Oak Park, where he enjoys the natural beauty and outdoor recreation opportunities, even if his two kids don't. Yeah, you know, it's a real honor to have Dan. So Dan, take it away.
Thanks, Dave. All right. Let's do some screen sharing.
Yeah, do it.
There we go.
Sounds good.
Why not? Okay.
You might want to go back to the beginning.
Yeah. Always go back to the first slide. I thought I'd shorten the talk a little by starting like at slide 2, but go to the first one. So thanks, everyone. As Dave said, and Ron or him, I'll be talking about urban tolerance and nesting birds in LA. I recently went back to grad school, proving that even if you're an older student, you can always try to relive your life over again and go to grad school yet again. So that was round 2, and I finished at UCLA with a PhD during the height of COVID in December of 2020. All right. So as the world becomes more urban, I've been really interested in studying the ways in which certain species are able to thrive in the face of urbanization, while others decline. And in particular, I'm interested in what allows some species to thrive in urban areas and restricts others to wildland. You know, how can some persist in cities and some just can't? And then how does this change over time and space? And so a lot of you are familiar with our twin kingbirds we have in Southern California. One tends to do real well in urban areas, the Cassins on the left, and then one just doesn't, the Western on the right. Finally, some of you know I've worked in the conservation field, I guess most of my adult life, and I'm very interested in learning ways in which research can inform conservation locally. So by 2030, which is just around the corner, urban cover is going to triple from its 2000 levels, which is in just an overwhelming land use change across the country with expected effects on the natural ecosystems that were once there. We're seeing this firsthand in the US. I mean, just remember birding in the 80s when you would drive to Chino Hills, what's now Chino Hills State Park, I used to see burrowing owls along that drive, and now it's kind of wall-to-wall houses. So that's nothing new in the US. It's happening everywhere in the world. And I'm just really interested in understanding these changes a little more. So let's start with some definitions. Urban land cover. I'll be using that a lot. Generally calling all land dominated by built features, so buildings, houses, roads, urban. And I'm distinguishing this from natural habitat, which is dominated by native vegetation and little changed by humans, at least not directly. There's something called an urban bird syndrome, which has been identified by researchers around the world, which is basically a suite of shared characters across unrelated species and groups of animals. And that unrelatedness is going to be important later. These include both physical traits, such as body size and wingspan, but also behavioral traits. So things like diet, habitat breadth, boldness, behavior, how innovative species may be, and phenology, like nesting times. But with each study, there's another study sort of contradicting it. So that's kind of an overgeneralization, but there's a lot that needs to be settled with this urban bird syndrome. And it probably varies by location. But from a conservation standpoint, we can probably agree that birds that tolerate or thrive in urbanization are going to be less vulnerable to extinction. After all, they're happy with this world of human activity that we're building. By contrast, those that are sensitive to human influence are probably more vulnerable to extinction, at least on the local level. So again, with these familiar SoCal species, a lot of you know, prairie falcon, it's really not found anywhere near urban areas, whereas Cooper's hawks seem to do real well. And some of you may recognize this off-ramp if you've driven into LA from the San Fernando Valley. This is Sunset Boulevard at LA, or at the 101 freeway. This year it was a red-tailed hawk. At the time the picture was taken, it was a Cooper's hawk. So tonight I'll be talking about these three dimensions of inquiry. I'm going to be using different but related data sets at different scales. I'll first be talking about a community of nesting raptors that have been studied for several decades in the hills west of the LA Basin, in the upper Malibu Creek watershed. And after that, I'll be discussing trends in nesting land birds in the LA Basin overall, using data from the LA Breeding Bird Atlas, as well as eBird. So let's start with the Malibu Creek watershed with a look at trends in nesting raptors. Now, the aim of this work was really to understand how and why certain species of raptors seem to be doing fine in the area, like red-tailed hawks, and why others like golden eagle had basically vanished. I was particularly interested in how nest site availability may play a role, and I suspected this may have something to do with proximity to urbanization. Basically, a certain species may have a threshold beyond which they just couldn't make a living in the Malibu watershed anymore. I wanted to know how the selection of nest sites might reflect patterns of urbanization, and also whether these patterns have changed over time. I was also interested in the role of nest trees, the species used, whether they're native or non-trees, and how this may also be changing over time. Okay, so why use raptors? Well, for one thing, they're found worldwide. So findings might have some relevance to other systems outside Southern California. They also use a very broad range of habitats, from land to woodland, lakes and streams. We can also, in our head, think of raptors using all these habitats all over the places we visited around the world. And they're frequently seen using human-modified habitats, from poles, towers to perches, ornamental trees for nests, now even cell phone towers. They consume a range of prey types. So you really have a lot to look at when you're looking at raptors. Importantly, these long-term studies, they tend to use the same nests over and over, especially if they're larger species, or at least occupy the same or nearby territories year after year. I guess I should have clicked. So are populations increasing or declining? This is this classic question in ecology. And there are many data sources out there we can use to see if the populations are just going up or down. We have Christmas bird count, breeding bird atlas, things like that, eBird. But without land use and land cover data, we can't really connect population change to a response to urbanization. Just see the trends. So my questions involved, are modern raptor territories more or less urbanized than early ones? And is this just because the landscape overall has become more urbanized, or are certain species actually selecting or preferring more urbanized sites than they were in prior decades? So we started with a study area. Conveniently enough, this was pretty much right where I lived. I'm a big proponent of making it on yourself. Don't study something that lives thousands of miles away. Just kind of roll out of bed, go outside and take some notes. That's my research philosophy. So to orient you, the study area extends roughly from the western edge of the San Fernando Valley. The urbanization is in violet. And then west across the Ventura County line into Thousand Oaks. So it straddles those two counties. Now, obviously, the study area has changed a bit in the last 50 years. Though interestingly enough, it's also seen a surge of conservation activity during that same period, such that large areas of hillside and canyon habitats have been protected, at least from development, if not from human disturbance entirely. So let's see if this works. There we go. So this is driving up Canaan from 101, 1967 on the left, and a couple years ago on the right. Turning onto Smoke Tree. Just look at all those trees today, and none of those trees. Oh, how much better it is. We have YouTube. Excuse me. All right. So like I said, the landscape looked pretty different. We have some big trees now that weren't there before. The wildlands look fairly similar. Oak savanna, oak woodland, although there's now quite a bit of drought impacting those areas, and we will be talking about that. So I had 6 focal species that currently nest or historically nested in the area. They include red-tailed hawk, red-shouldered hawk, Cooper's hawk, that all nest there today, and then 3 that are sort of marginal. Golden eagle no longer nests in the study area, and neither does white-tailed kite. I think the last kites nested just before we moved there in about 2010. Kestrel is still holding on. We'll be talking about kestrels in a sec. And interestingly enough, even within Southern California, there's been quite a bit of contradictory information about urban tolerance and decline of these species. So get to the bottom of that. Well, fortunately, I had access to 2 data sets of historical nesting information for the study area. One was from the 1970s and 80s, maintained by National Park Service. The other was from the early 2000s that were developed by a grad student at UCLA named Lena Lee. And she actually studied under Hartmut Walter, who I think a lot of you know. In 2017 and 2018, I set about revisiting all of these nest sites and found a few new ones of my own, and I incorporated those into the study. And so I ended up with these 3 eras. I'll call them eras. The early era from the 70s and 80s, the middle era from the early 2000s, and the late era of this study. I ended up with about 180 nest sites total. And this is just a graphic showing you where they are. This is my neighborhood. So we have a Cooper's hawk over on the left, which was documented in 1980, a new red tail in the middle from 2017, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so what's nest? What's an active nest? My data set relied on specific and certain locations of actual nests, not just where maybe a hawk had been seen or 2 had been seen, foraging, perching. Otherwise, I really couldn't tie that nest to the surrounding urbanization. And the whole point of the study was to see how urbanization was pushing raptors around. So I really needed to get it geographically tied. So a nest is a newish looking nest. That's the first tell of a nest, an active nest. 2 birds of your target species within 100 feet or so of the nest. That's good. Nest building, food provisioning or carrying, young in the nest. And then finally, they're really nailed down whether they're successful or not, fledglings. All right. So in addition to gathering information on nest sites, I matched those older nests with the land use that was present during those early years, because it did change quite a bit during the 70s and 80s. Then it slowed down in terms of urbanization. So to do this, I found some historical photography from the 1970s at the UCSB library, hard copies, and redrew the urban boundary all through my study area from that early era, and then I converted it to a shapefile using GIS. So here's what it looked like. Percent urban cover in the study area increased by about threefold from 1975 to 2010. Human population doubled. And then since 2004, there wasn't much change. So I used one coverage for that early era, and then I used this modern CalVeg coverage for the middle era and the modern era. All right. Then I had to draw some blobs. I used GIS to draw circles around these nest sites, calculated the percent urban cover around each of these 170 nests. I used two buffer distances. Some papers I had read talked about like a territory size and a foraging range size. And so I just said, well, it's not that hard. It's just a couple lines of code. I'll just look at both and see what that tells me. It turns out they were really similar, all my results at those two radii. And so Pete Bloom, who said, why did you do that, was right. I really didn't have to. It's a good lesson. Just call up Pete, ask him what to do. He'll tell you. All right, so then I developed these four modes of nest site change that each raptor species could engage in based on the amount of urban land cover surrounding each nest. So if you consider the nest to be the GPS location of the nest, the territory is that buffer around the nest. And then some degree of urbanization would be calculated in the buffer and associated with that nest site. So I had these three modes: withstanding, maintaining, preferring, and avoiding. So let's talk about the modes. So here's withstanding. So I called this scenario where the nest site and the territory doesn't move at all to be withstanding. So basically the city expands and occupies more of that raptor's territory, but the bird stays put. It keeps using the same tree year after year and sort of withstands the amount of urbanization that's going on around it. Right? Then there's maintaining. So this is where the nest territory shifts away from the expanding edge of urbanization, or the bird maintains roughly the same level of urbanization somehow as the decades go on. Shifts a little bit. It always just likes a little bit of urban, mostly rural, or a lot of urban, a little rural, something like that. Just shifts around. Right? Okay, urban preferring is kind of what it sounds like. A raptor may start to prefer urban cover, shifting its nest site toward and into urban development. Just think of it as cities pulling birds away from the surrounding wildland areas. And then urban avoiding is just the opposite. The raptor shifts its territory away from urbanization, becoming even less urban than it was in the past. Now, it's not enough to simply measure urbanization around these nests and all your conclusions from that, because in order to show a preference by each species, we really need to account for all the options landscape for nest sites. So one way to do that would be to map and measure thousands of trees and then just calculate a model based on that. But I really didn't have the time. I got a lot of stuff going on, and I just didn't want to spend 30 years getting a PhD. And so I opted for this indirect method of measuring nest options, which is a random point analysis. So to do that, I plotted random points across the study area and compared those to the actual nest. So I had random nest sites, these fake nest sites, and then actual nest sites. I calculated percent urban cover in those buffer distances, just like I did for the observed nests. And then I compared the differences in urban cover for observed versus random nests. This is just a basic concept in statistical analysis. What did you observe versus what did you expect? And then I repeated this calculation for each of my three eras to see how these changed. All right. So let's dig into the data. So we'll start with red-tailed hawk. I call this withstanding. Now, red-tails are withstanders in that the mean urban cover around nests did increase, particularly between the early and middle era, but territories were kept to below 50% urban cover. And importantly, urban cover around random points was found to be not statistically different from observed nest sites, meaning they're apparently not selecting or avoiding urban territories relative to less developed territories. So here's like the visual model of what's going on. As long as the territories have at least half open land, roughly, for foraging, red-tails basically go with the flow and just sit there. Now, this is strongly supported by life history info. They do maintain the same nest sites year after year, as long as they're not top down. This one on the left is the top of Mulholland between Bel Air and Sherman Oaks. And, unfortunately, the nest was top down. The hawks weren't in it, but we went back during the LA Raptor survey and found it missing in action. So hopefully they'll find another place to nest. All right, let's contrast with the strategy of Cooper's hawk. So for this species, urban cover around the nest more than inched up. By the late era, nests were being placed in territories averaging more than 75% urban cover. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my mouse. And they're clearly preferring sites that are more urban than those available across the landscape, as seen by these stark differences in random points versus observed nest sites in that late era. We had similar results for red-shouldered hawk, but honestly, we found so few red-shouldered hawks, I'm not sure I believe those. So again, this is confirmed by life history. A lot of Cooper's hawks, at least 50% of the populations we're studying in LA, switch nests every year. And long-term monitoring in Orange County, Pete Bloom, who I mentioned, has documented a loss in the order of 90% of wildland nest sites in his study areas down there. Whereas urban territories are doing relatively well compared to those. All right. Then we have the American kestrel, a species that started out very unurban and did not keep pace as the landscape urbanized. So Lara didn't have any data because Lena did not study kestrels. But yeah, today kestrels are really only found nesting in these really remote grasslands of the study area. So like in the middle of Malibu Creek State Park, there's a pair. Upper Cheeseboro, there's a pair. Nowhere near housing tracts or even ranchette communities of Old Agora. They just don't have nesting kestrels. And this pattern is occurring despite seemingly suitable nesting habitat, low places and roofs and dead trees throughout the region. Not as many dead trees as you might think. So this is what kestrels are doing. They're urban avoiding species. Well, let's look at how these three species of raptors are adapting by looking at the trees they select for nest sites and how this has changed over time. So if you compare the use of non-native trees for red-tailed hawks and Cooper's hawks between the early and late era, you see that red-tailed hawks and Cooper's have greatly increased the use of non-native trees, while red-shouldered hawks have sort of maintained that preference over time. And this is borne out again in our Los Angeles Raptor study, which I may give a talk on at some point, where we're finding just most of our Cooper's hawks are in non-native trees. And in fact, I think almost all of our red tails are too, to think of it. So while there are other forces at play, three of the extirpated or very rare species, the golden eagle and white-tailed kite and kestrel, avoided non-natives altogether and are still absent. Now, of course, red-tailed Coopers avoided non-natives too at the time they were still around, but there may be something to that. So what insights have we gotten from the Malibu Creek Watershed study? Well, one is that raptor species can change their tolerance for urbanization over time, particularly with Cooper's hawk being the best example. It also appears that tree species type, particularly non-native trees, are playing a role in allowing raptors to persist in urban and suburban areas. But other factors are surely involved, like prey availability, which we can look at. So that leaves the door open for a lot of future research in these and other bird communities. Now, we only had 6 species. So interesting information. Is it statistically significant? I mean, for raptors it is, I guess. But maybe we could look at other birds, like for chapter 2 of a dissertation or something. So now I'm going to switch gears and talk about some other birds. So I decided to expand the pool of nesting species evaluated for my second chapter. I'm only doing 2 chapters, so don't worry, get you out of here on time. And I wanted to look at all the nesting bird species, all the species in the LA basin. Specifically, I was interested in seeing if certain ecological traits I was seeing in raptors were also present in these other groups. So like these phoebes here, one of which is highly tolerant of urban life, and the other is somewhat less so. Black phoebe, Say's phoebe. But you're birders, you know that. You know what these phoebes are. So aside from just ticking off traits of urban birds and saying, I was also interested in how these trends might be changing over time. So for example, are there species that are becoming more urban or less urban? And how can this be observed over time? A couple examples, familiar to most birders. Well, to do this, I had to travel back in time in the data. And fortunately, Los Angeles is really the ideal place to do this kind of historical ornithology. A really long history of people studying birds, and one of the most active, if not the most active, birding communities on the planet, you folks. Settled on 2 main data sets for this analysis, the 1990s LA Breeding Bird Atlas, and more recent records from eBird. A lot more recent records, even until I cut it off at 2016, and we even had over 1 million then. So I restricted my analysis to the main region of urban and urban edge habitats in the LA area, which is the LA basin on the coastal slope below 2,000 feet. Once you get into Santa Clarita, the ecology changes a little bit. You get a few more arid species and you lose out on a lot of coastal slope species. So my study area, I wanted to keep like apples to apples, and like those things found in the east are found in the west. That's the idea. So I had to hand enter the species data from each of the 173 atlas blocks that are shown. I don't even think it was entered in Excel. On hard copy files that I'm storing, but it was it was time consuming, I'll tell you that. But it's in the service of science, so it's a few days. So I was then able to generate maps based on species status within the study area, similar to those in the 2016 Atlas publication for each regularly breeding species, like say Cooper's hawk. Here's where Cooper's hawks were breeding in the late 1990s. So just fix that in your head. Sorry, I had to cough. And then here's where Cooper's hawks were breeding in the 20-teens from eBird. So I applied the same rules to the more recent eBird data using the same block boundaries, and I assigned a numeric value 0 to 2 based on how sure I was that Cooper's hawks were breeding in a given block. So in the sense, I retrofitted eBird data, applied the same rules of Atlas data, and so I tried to compare same maps, used safe dates, eliminated some erroneous stuff, and eventually developed these breeding scores for each species based on the number of blocks they occurred in. So as you can see, Cooper's hawk expanded quite a bit from the early to the late era, but not every species expanded, but they did. And I then plotted these breeding scores from the newer eBird data against those of the older BBA data. And I was able to see which species have either contracted or expanded their ranges across the LA basin in the past 20 years. So those above the line have become more widespread and occupied more blocks, while those below the line have become less so. And I'll let you sit with that for a sec. You can really probably see some familiar species in there that it's like, oh man, I am seeing a lot more Allen's hummingbirds. And I even stopped calling them Rufus. Okay, so then I was also interested in this link between urban preference and range expansion within the LA basin. So what I had to do is find a way to link urban cover with the widespreadness of each species. Now I did have to teach myself GIS. So I used the open source software QGIS and a public data layer, CalVeg, to calculate percent urban cover within each atlas block. I was then able to generate this urban index value for each of my 53 species. Basically, it's a single digit measure of urban tolerance that links urban cover and breeding status on the block, averaging the breeding score with the correlation coefficient of urban cover across all blocks. So basically, how urban is your bird? And I also, another assumption I did was I assumed that cover across the LA basin was essentially unchanged from the late 90s to the late 2010s. It's not entirely true everywhere, but a lot of the growth has been in the outskirts and Santa Clarita anyway, and that wasn't really part of my study. So, all right, so let's see how this stuff looks. Started getting interesting. Sometimes the correlation coefficients were 0 between urban cover and breeding status in cases where a species was found mostly in natural habitat. That is, it avoided urban cover. In the 1990s, the Cooper's hawk was definitely doing that. So forget about how widespread Cooper's hawk is. Let's just see how urban Cooper's hawk is. And in fact, it was negatively urban. Most of those blocks where it occurred in the 1990s were not the same blocks that are urban. They were the undeveloped blocks. Well, by the 2010s, its urban tolerance had really flipped to positive, and its range was actually positively correlated with urban cover. In other words, Cooper's hawk was becoming more urban. All right, so we can plot this and figure out what other species were doing this. Again, I plotted late versus early data for each species, this time using the urban index rather than number of blocks. Here we can see that Cooper's hawk isn't alone. There are a couple other species that seem to be shifting into urban habitats as gauged by their getting more urban. Hood orioles, orange-crowned warblers fall into this category. And some that you might not expect, but then when you think about it, purple finches is one that I've definitely noticed the last 10, 20 years. You're just seeing them in suburban areas. You might walk in the hills of Sherman Oaks and just hear one singing. And in the 90s, you just didn't have as many of those purple finches doing it. The drought has hit them quite a bit. But so at the same time, a suite of species appears to be becoming a bit less urban, pulling away from urban blocks and more restricted to wildland habitat. So in fact, you probably are seeing fewer quail in the hills right around your house, even though the open space is still there. There does seem to be some retreat. You look at species that have changed the most in this regard, and we do that by looking at which have the biggest spread between their early urban index and their modern urban index. So this is basically how urban they're becoming. You probably recognize a lot of these from your backyard or neighborhood walk, and you might have thought, yes, I'm seeing more juncos. I'm seeing more juncos. Some of these species, interestingly enough, could be contracting the ranges while becoming more urban. So Costa's hummingbird was one that's kind of stuck out to me, and I don't know what's going on. I suspect it could be like a quirk of eBird that it does flag and as hummingbirds that are misidentified as Costa's. But we might want to look into that a little more to see what Costa's might be doing. But I think it's observer error. I don't know. But science is looking at big picture stuff. Let's not get bogged down in the details. Now, these patterns are thinking about traits, of course. In other words, is there some reason Allen's hummingbird has been expanding its range for 20 years, while Costa seems to be contracting its range? Jotted down notes on all these birds. Some of these, if you've been birding a long time, you just sort of know this stuff about these species, but here was a chance to kind of prove that. And I looked at data sets that measure these traits, including one maintained by a colleague at University of Utah, who I knew from undergrad, John Suckersiglu. He has this massive like diet database, nest database. So he was one of the co-authors. I piled up some life history traits. And, if you go back to grad school, you can't get out without doing some modeling. So I had to convince Allison Schultz at the LA County Museum to get me up to speed on how those scientists were doing it these days. Since the last time I took statistics, I actually used graph paper. So here's my ecological and behavioral traits and values, and plugged it into equations with the urban index scores early and late. And as a lot of you know, we don't have to talk about models too much, but it's basically a multi-dimensional equation where the computer tries to like thread a line through a bunch of variable values to see how well they correlate, whether it's significant or not. So I found some significant correlations with this. I found that structure nest birds, that certain traits were correlated with my urban indices, including structure nesting. So which birds nest on towers and things like that, poles. And that was positively correlated with the urban index. And interestingly enough, natural cavity nesting was negative. So maybe, Cassin's kingbirds and house wrens are at an advantage because they nest in structures. I didn't really use birdhouses, but other things like flickers and ones that we really only find in natural cavities are negatively associated. Now that I think about it, I didn't use parrots. I knocked a few species out that didn't occur across the whole basin. So parrots would be interesting. We do have a split where we have black-headed conures on one side of the basin and Amazons on the other. So that would be another really interesting thing to look at, which Alice and I have talked about a little bit, is looking at this, what non-native species are doing in the urban landscape and how they're using it. So I inserted values for phylogenetic relatedness as well, but this really had no significant effect on the results, which is not too surprising because it suggests that these patterns were present across families of birds. So it wasn't just one family, and if you related to like hummingbirds, you'd be tolerant of urbanization. No, it was many types of species can get common and also rare in urban areas. Okay, so let's give some take homes. One thing, a wide variety of birds have managed to adapt and thrive in urban LA as breeders. They will likely continue to take advantage of what we build for ourselves. Few species are becoming less urban over time, but a lot started this way, like quail. The focus of my work, you could look at both ends. You could look at what's becoming more common urbanization, and then you could look at what's declining. The focus of this chapter was really looking at what's thriving and why, what's expanding and why. Interestingly enough, few species are retreating from urban areas into wildland areas. The opposite seems to be true for a lot of birds in LA, like Buick's wrens, dark-eyed juncos. We're just seeing a lot of sort of infiltration of the basin by birds that, when I was starting birding in the 80s, were really like birds you'd see on hikes, not birds you'd see like on the walk around your block. So many of these wildland species are sort of stuck on the periphery of the city, like quail, and are very much not adapting to urbanization. So if one were to continue these studies, you might look at those wren tits, things like that, roadrunner, to see reasons why they might not be adapting to urbanization. That'd be really interesting. So quail is one. Flicker, certainly. Flickers have been almost driven to extinction in the LA basin as breeders. So we can look at how species utilize and adapt to ornament landscaping. It might deal with drastic reductions in irrigation, which is happening now, and that could change urban landscaping. We could look at diet throughout the year, feeder use. We could look at behavioral traits. I wasn't really satisfied with these giant databases that just give you like a number for, the number of, types of things it eats as a diet. It's a 5, it's a 4. I think you could do some really interesting granular analyses with behavior, with a big sample size, with local species. But on the other end, you could expand. You could look at other neighborhoods, other cities across the country and across the world. We could look at within species. Are juncos in urban areas versus wildland areas acting differently? Well, the focus of a number of grad students at UCLA for the last few years is really teasing those intra-species differences out based on an urban gradient. So to bring it home to the place we live, which is urban areas, what are some take-homes? Well, not all dead trees need to be removed. This is an actual kestrel nest site that I found in Cheeseboro Canyon, and there just aren't that many kestrels. And I know I, like you, got a note from the county saying, I need to take out this dead tree in the boulevard in front of the house. Like $1,500 later, the tree was gone. So it was only half dead. You multiply this with every landowner, homeowner in the region, and that's a lot of dead trees that are just being pulled out of the urban areas. So looking at how many non-urban species are associated with these natural cavities is kind of interesting. So other things that just doing this research got me thinking about bird conservation in urban areas that affect the habitats, behavior, populations of wild birds, certainly the cacophony of leaf blowers every day, the role of feeders, what trees we plant, where we plant them, how we maintain them, over or under watering, as the case may be. We've heard a lot about cats and anticoagulant rodenticide. That's certainly something we're seeing the effects on in the LA Raptor study. And then things that allow for wild things in our urban areas, like planting natives and then just changing the regime of when you trim plants, I think is going to be increasingly important. And then just an obligatory plug for everyone that's continuing to contribute to community science platforms. I'm sure you've heard that the data is being used by researchers, and I'm one of them. So, what you've seen and heard tonight really would not be possible without the dedicated efforts of birders and naturalists like you across the region. Okay, so just for some acknowledgments, I got into UCLA with this UCLA Grand Challenge grant to study the future of LA. And that kind of got me through. I got some small grants. My academic committee was certainly super helpful, as were all the non-committee members down at the bottom who basically shepherded me through my round 2 of grad school. So definitely grateful for all their help. And that's it. So I think
fantastic.
Take some questions. Yeah, wake up, everyone.
Wonderful, great.
No,
actually, thank you very much, Dan.
Sure.
Yeah, Dan, that was wonderful. It was wonderful. Anyone who has questions, please pop them into the Q&A. That helps us kind of keep track of all the questions, make sure that we've gotten everything.
Mm-hmm. And I see one in the Q&A now. Travis asks, are there particular non-native tree species that are used more by Cooper's hawks than their prevalence in the environment?
Oh, yes. Should I stop sharing, guys? Is it easier?
Well, I don't know if you'll
It doesn't
want
matter.
to
If you want, you might want to go back to a slide or something.
Yeah, I'll leave it. Yeah, Travis, hi. Yes, so our study, collecting tree data, but what we need to do, and we've talked about eventually doing, is looking at some of the great City of LA and other data where they've actually mapped all the trees across portions of the basin. So the ones that come to mind for Cooper's hawks are chamal ash, which is the big ash tree that some people call velvet ash. It's actually this Mesoamerican plant called chamal ash, and you probably have one in your yard or on your block. They're super common. They were planted in the 70s and 80s, and now they have reached the height that is ideal for a Cooper's hawk. The red tails don't use chamal ashes. We've never found a nest of a red tail in one. Most of our red tail nests are in Canary Island pines. A few are in sycamores, a few are in the remaining eucalyptus. But as a lot of you know, the blue gum eucalyptus, which was the king of Southern California landscaped ornamental trees for a century, they've been dying or just are being removed. Like, they're never being planted and are only being removed. And they were used extensively by red tails and red shoulders and Coopers. So I am not a non-native proponent, but it's super interesting, what aspects of our built environment are being used for those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Travis also points out, I have a digital file of all the Atlas observations. We should talk about getting it publicly archived for research purposes and start gearing up for round 2. So
now, Travis, that would have been good information about
it. Now you tell me. That's
yeah. Dan, why don't you go ahead and stop sharing at the moment, and thank you. And so
wonderful. Another question from Yvonne. Really wonderful talk. Were you able to capture number of nestlings and number fledged at the urban nests, or is this in future plans?
We did. Yeah, we did look at that. So for the Malibu Creek study, which was that longitudinal study, I wasn't really looking at productivity. It was just too much. I was just looking at site placement. For the LA Raptor study that's ongoing now, we just finished our 6th year, and I just submitted the final report today. We are looking at fledgling number, and there's some really interesting stuff preliminarily having to do with rainfall the prior year, influencing the number of chicks in the nest. So that's data that I think I'd like to get a couple more years under our belt, and then we'll look to publish that.
Great. Let's see. Beth asks, when the young raptors have to find their own territories she says, when the young raptors have to find their own territories in urban areas, is it a problem of availability?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we didn't ban raptors, right? So we don't know exactly where these young are ending up. And actually, just look at Travis's response. Yeah, I did that. I guess I asked everyone else. Yeah, when we're looking at these young birds moving around the landscape, Pete Bloom and his colleagues have documented these super long distance dispersals by young birds. And what some of them do is they go and come back. So red tails and other things, the first years will go up to the Great Basin and then end up the next spring back right near their territory. Just anecdotally, what we've seen around LA is if we see a first or second year red tail, so without the red tail that they get that 3rd year, if we see one of those in the breeding season, it's almost certainly an inactive territory. There's not a nest nearby, there's not an adult pair nearby, and they're letting that 1st year sort of like have that canyon and screw around, and like that seems to be the trend. And then at some point, presumably they'll mature, attract a mate, and that will become the territory. So an example is Dixie Canyon and Sherman Oaks. That has had a young red tail for the last few years, whereas one canyon over in either direction has had an active nest every year.
Interesting.
Lily asks, if American kestrels are urban intolerant, how are the populations in Ballona wetlands and Madrona Marsh able to persist?
Great question. That's a great question. This is why you should not restrict your study to one study area. I can't believe they gave me a PhD. That's a whole other discussion. You should broaden your horizons, look at a lot of different areas. The only active kestrel we have had on the LA Raptor study was, you'll never believe this, but it was nesting in the roof of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion. And the birds would forage in between the off-ramp lanes of Temple Street off 101. So
really?
Yeah. So when I say the kestrels need a lot of open space, yeah, they do in the Malibu Creek watershed for whatever reason. It's a huge mystery to me why kestrels are persisting in those other, it could be competition. So maybe at Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, you don't have a Cooper's hawk killing a bunch of kestrels, because look, if Cooper's hawks have expanded by tenfold or whatever they've been doing in our area, that's going to probably come at the expense of smaller raptors or other species. So,
All right.
yeah.
And speaking of the LA Raptor study, Narit put into the chat the link for
Thank you, Nareet. Yes.
the link for
The press agent has
tomorrow.
reminded us all. Tune in tomorrow.
Yeah, tune in tomorrow. So check out the link in the chat so that you can RSVP for the final presentation for the 2022 LA Raptor study.
Great. Wow. Let's see, we have more questions. Calvin asks, if you were to study more recently exotic introduced species in the urban landscape, would you be able to compare the species changes over time, or would you look at just the urbanization and widespreadness for now?
Yeah. I mean, you can certainly do both. With eBird, it's interesting. Like eBird, if you look at the mass of data, prior to 2012, it's not much. And even since 2016, it's really expanded with the use of handheld devices with eBird. Thanks, Dave. It's exploded. And so, yeah, I think the data quality kind of declines each year especially prior to 2012. But yeah, do both.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
great. Yvonne asks, your data can certainly help in arguing for reduction in rodenticide use at your sites. Great to have productive site placement in the database.
For sure. We're still seeing effects of rodenticide. I talked to someone at Ojai Raptor Center, and I think they said that every raptor they test has rodenticide at some level. So whether they died of it or not, they're coming in injured or picked up. So yeah, it's a huge problem still.
Yeah.
We have a question from the live stream from Tracy. Was there a change in the number of nests between the 3 eras studied?
Yes, and Tracy, I don't have that number off the top of my head, but I had to work with the data I had, right? So I couldn't go back in time and find more nests, but I don't think it affected things statistically. But yeah, that's one of the limitations of historical data. Is that you just, if they found 10 nests, that's what you're stuck with. So, yeah.
Great. Another question by Ian. It seems like migration stopover data would also be useful to look at effects of the urban use. I heard on Lifeless podcast about an owl that spent a number of days hunting during migration in downtown Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I looked at nesting in those 2 data sets, 3 data sets or more. You could look at wintering, right? So in winter, we do have kestrels all over the study area. They just don't breed. It doesn't mean that the habitat is less important. It is important to sustain kestrels. It's just that they're using this area for nesting. This reminded me of at LAX, when Rob Hamilton and I were doing a study for SoFi Stadium, we were introduced to the USDA guy responsible for raptor control at LAX. And what they do is they trap the raptors, they get onto the runway, band them, and release them miles away. And the numbers that they get of kestrels, dozens and dozens and dozens of kestrels every year. And so there's something about LAX that in the fall, they all flood in, that used to be the coastal prairie of LA, and it still probably has tons of grasshoppers and great foraging for kestrels. And, it's just amazing how these birds are still finding their way to our urban landscape and, doing okay. But yeah, for sure, there's a lot to learn.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Great.
And
are there any more questions?
I think we're actually slowing down.
Yeah.
Dan, thank you very, very much for the webinar. It was absolutely wonderful. I think we all enjoyed it.
Yep,
Okay.
absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks all for attending, and I'll probably see a lot of you in real life out birding soon.
Oh, of course.
Of course, of courch.
Okay,
And
bye,
I
everyone.
just want to remind everyone that next week at 7 o'clock will be Marky Muchler will be here to talk about night calls, nocturnal bird calls.
Like, yeah.
Oh, just want to make sure we're not missing anything. Lots of thank yous in the chat, and I'll pass those along. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Looks good. Just more thank yous in the chat.
Looks good.
Right.
In that case, thanks, Stan. We're looking forward to chapter 3.
Sounds good. Okay, bye, everyone.
Bye.
Okay.
Good
goodbye,
night,
Dan.
everyone.
Goodbye, everybody.
See everyone next week at 7 o'clock.